Hi, my name is Frank Schaefer, and as we head into the new year, I want to talk about something that too few people talk about. And often when it is said, people associate this with right-wing or conservative or Roman Catholic or evangelical voices. But what I'm going to talk about is a society-wide problem that the right, the left, liberals, conservatives, religious people, non-religious people, atheists, agnostic, Jews, Christians, Muslims, all of us are part of the problem, and we all bear the consequence. And that is something I'm going to call the disaster of the sexual revolution. And I'm going to be reading a little bit from notes I've made here because I'll be quoting some people and I want to get it right. So if you see my eyes flicking up to the screen behind there, I'm doing some reading. And I'll also be talking extemporaneously as I do on all my It Has to Be Said commentaries. So bear with me. Let me start with a quote that I found very interesting. "We're nerds. We were raised by machines," says a character in The Matrix Resurrections. This is true when it comes to the question, whatever happened to love? Whatever happened to sexuality? Meeting and mating replaced by an app, AI, people who don't date or have sex, multiple divorces, 50% of the American public being raised in families by either single mothers or divorced parents. People like Esther Perel, the brilliant woman who analyzes sexual practice and habits in our lives, talking about the decline of sexuality even within marriages. I think wherever we come from, we can agree that all is not well in the area of relationships. Maybe we should ask the anti-science parents and university professors who talk about career, and never about love. Or maybe we should ask the faux feminists of the 1970s and 1980s who seem to present a stark false choice: career or kids, marriage or freedom, family or autonomy and choice, love or job status, sexual pleasure or what they called the bondage of commitment. Let's just say it. The sexual revolution was a disaster. And if you want to know why Trump is president for a second time and you don't like this presidency, or if you're in an evangelical voter mode and you love his presidency because he's bringing you back to traditional family values, so-called, odd choice given what he's done with his own life, this applies to you as well. I'll start with something that appeared in the left-wing newspaper, The Guardian, on February 12, 2022, where Annie Lord was writing, "While the men I saw on screen," this is a woman writing about her first exposure to porn as a child, "did lots of different things to the women they slept with. Slapping, choking, pulling, gagging. It always had the same effect. She would arch her back and moan louder. We didn't read this as an unrealistic or uninspiring sign because it fitted in with the world we were told we should learn to live with. When it came to having sex, my friends and I knew to pretend to like it when guys started using that aggressive gun finger motion between our legs or mistook a thigh crease for a clitoris. That seemed to be a woman's role in sex, as in life, liking stuff done to us. We were trying to make men feel good, but the whole time teaching them they didn't need to do the same for us," end quote. Jeannie, my wife that I've been with for 56 years, and I pair bonded in the 1970s when fidelity was already falling out of fashion. But she came from a Roman Catholic background and my parents were evangelicals. And so when I got her pregnant, it seemed normal that we would get married and start a family. Now, if someone had been betting on Jeannie and me, as I talk about in my new book, The Gospel of Zip, which talks about our lifelong relationship and why and how it worked and how it didn't work sometimes and what we've learned, as well as about our dog Zip and what we've learned from him about relationships that humans would do well to learn about. But nevertheless, we came together when porn was still only in magazines and CD theaters and not in every child's bedroom on a phone. And so Jeannie and I made it in this still more idealistic world with the glow of the 1960s free love craze kind of foreshadowing what we were doing. Love was still a thing. The sexual revolution was in the air, but love was still fashionable. We married when fewer did marry, but people still get married in big numbers back in those days, and we stayed together when divorce was a thing to do if you fight a lot, which we did, as I talk about in the Gospel of Zip. In fact, I go through some of our worst fights and describe them because I want people to know that it is possible to stay together in spite of the limitations of any relationship. We had children young, while couples around us pushed their fertility clocks to a one-child boundary in service of higher education demands followed by mighty career demands. We were grandparents to grandchildren, the same age as our friends' first children. Young people were being raised in blended families or no families by the millions. By the 1990s, many of these children, now grown, gave up on even the idea of bonding for life and had no expectation of a long-term relationship, let alone lifelong commitment that we experienced and have benefited from, surrounded by a family of children and grandchildren that love each other and care for each other, where we've done the majority of the child care for our grandchildren. They haven't had babysitters, they've had us. We've been very lucky. But more than luck, it's because our family was not affected by the sexual revolution in the way many people have been, or the aftermath of it. I'm not talking about sexual promiscuity, I'm talking about the atmosphere. So let me get to that. Less and less do Jeannie and I meet people who fall in love or are, quote, still married or stay married once married in a lifelong commitment. And this isn't because they're not religious or have become atheists or are liberals or conservatives. This is just because of the aftermath of the sexual revolution, where if you have problems in a marriage, you're expected to get divorced. If you have problems blending career and childcare, then what suffers usually is the childcare, not the career, because of the priorities we've adopted after the sexual revolution. So let me be blunt. The sexual revolution, okay, you're not going to like this, was led by rapists, creeps, and women-abusing scum. And this, quote, revolution accepted by boomers, that's my generation, too dumb and cowardly to oppose degradation for fear of seeming old-fashioned or illiberal, became what dominated our sexual lives and our relationships, even if we ourselves were not part of it. That was the culture we were in the 70s and the 80s. In turn, the courts went along. Fast forward to our rape culture, wherein porn is a de facto sex education for males and females alike. And here's the irony. The only thing the sexual revolution combined with career worship achieved was to create the worst lovers the world has ever seen. We'll get to Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump, and Bill Clinton in a moment. The groundwork laid for normalizing the loss of intimacy can be summed up in the life work of Alfred Kinsey, who became so fashionable in left-wing circles, including Hollywood, that a hagiographic movie was made about him in which he sort of appears as a hero. But who was Kinsey really in the 1940s? Who led the charge against, quote, conservative sexual ideas, which is ironic because conservative sexual ideas have their root in evolution and survival methods of human beings, wherein the survival of the friendliest is why we're all still here, not the survival of the most violent or the most predatory. So who was Kinsey? Well, he was a pedophile creep and zoologist with expertise in gall wasp biology with something to prove, and that was that his pedophilia was okay. So he switched to the study of human sex. In his two major works, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, 1948, and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, 1953, Kinsey claimed that children could and should experience sexual pleasure from toddler, you got that right, stage on. The sexual abuse of young children as part of his study was recorded by Kinsey, by him and other people, including masturbating toddlers, to test his theory that the youngest of children desire sex in his own wish fulfillment as a pedophile. That sex is what we all want rather than intimacy. That's a big point. That there are no rules about how to be happy in relationships. There was no need for a sexual revolution, Kinsey said, only a legal revolution, so we, read he, the pedophile looking for justification, didn't have to lie about our, read his, the pedophile seeking self-justification, sex lives, and live hypocritically. To even question Kinsey got one labeled as a prude or religious or conservative or an evangelical or a Catholic. In other words, a hater of progress in the mind of the academic elite who all went along with Kinsey and acted as if somehow this was a liberating idea and that evangelicals and Christians and Muslims and traditional Hindus and conservative Roman Catholics were somehow backward. And they, of course, had it backward themselves because sexual intimacy and protection is rooted in our evolutionary history before there was such a thing as civilization or even farming or agrarian culture or cities or religions. It goes right back into the hunter-gatherer stage of human development. As I talk about in my book, where I quote at length Elizabeth Marshall Thomas in her book, The Old Way, what she discovered living in the Kalahari Desert in the 1950s with the Sand People, the Bushmen of the Kalahari, and their practices of marriage, fidelity, and family and connection. And these were not Christians. They'd never heard of Jesus Christ. They weren't Roman Catholics. Theirs was not old-fashioned unless you count the 100,000 years that had made them successful hunter-gatherers by not trashing their lives, but by bonding and mating and caring and loving. Okay? All right. Caleb Cranecut noted in the New York Times, quote, and I'm reading this now, "The truth about Kinsey's sex life exists, but it is locked away in the archives of the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction at Indiana University, encoded with the 7,985 sex histories, things like masturbating children and recording what happened, he collected, and another 10,000 or so collected by his team, and protected by the Institute's strict policy on confidentiality. They still don't want people to know what's in there. They still don't want people. You talk about the Epstein files. What about the truth about what's in the Kinsey Institute for Research, Sex and Gender Reproduction at Indiana University files? They still don't want to know what's in there. They don't want us to know. In the article, it was called, "Was Kinsey a Liberator or a Pervert?" October 3, 2004. The article details some of Kinsey's ties with other serial pedophiles. And I'm reading from the article in the New York Times now, which, by the way, ironically, all through their history, took the side of, quote, sexual liberation, which really wasn't liberation at all. It was the destruction of the ability to have monogamous relationships, all in the name of liberal progress. All right? You ask why Trump is president? Because about half of America hated this and got angrier and angrier and angrier. And when Roe v. Wade codified abortion in a full stop judicial fiat, they rebelled, and it took 50 years, and then they overturned it. And that's what made him president, the hatred of the results of the sexual revolution, while, and here's the big irony, going along with it and following a sexual predator, Donald Trump, very much the product of that revolution. And so we come full circle. All right. So quoting the New York Times, Kinsey wrote to King coaxing him to send his detailed desires of his sexual exploits, including those with children. On November 24, 1944, for example, Kinsey wrote, quote, quoting Kinsey, quoted in the New York Times, "I rejoice at everything you send," and that's to a pedophile who's been masturbating children, "for I am then assured that much more of your material is saved for scientific publication," end quote. Kinsey published much of King's data in sexual behavior in the human male, where tables summarize King's attempts to bring to orgasm, you listening? Boys between the ages of 2 months and 15 years old, in some cases over a period of as long as 24 hours, masturbating and stimulating a toddler for 24 hours. And this is the sort of thing the liberal media all went for and said, oh, this is a hero. He's liberated us from Christian convention. Fast forward to the Trump presidency of people storming the Capitol and threatening to hang a vice president if he doesn't confirm Trump's term, a second presidency. The fury, the rage that the liberal media doesn't want to deal with and the academic community doesn't want to deal with is the fruit of the sexual revolution. They want to talk about economics and Rust Belt and lack of jobs, What they don't want to talk about is the truth about the culture war. And the truth about the culture war is the sexual revolution unleashed a 50-year pushback, a 60-year pushback that Trump is sitting in the White House because of. And in A Curse on America, the person in the White House is a product of the sexual revolution. Ultimate irony, the family values man who will restore family values as a biblical mandate from the point of view of evangelicals is the worst predator we've ever seen in the White House. Quoting the New York Times, yet no one objected to them publicly until 1981, because the academic community was silent about this, when they came to the attention of an independent researcher named Judith Reisman. Ms. Reisman has devoted much of the last 2 decades to her case against Kinsey. Okay, end quote of the New York Times. All right, moving forward. Playboy's founder, a creep loved by Hollywood celebrities, also trafficked people for sex, and he drugged girls. In his pre-Me Too iteration of Hugh Hefner, said he felt liberated by Kinsey's discoveries. No wonder. Hefner also was a pimp for abuse and was a degenerate soulmate with Kinsey, being defended by so-called liberal establishment that found him very funny and interesting and would go hang out in the Hefner mansion, the Playboy mansion, in the same way that a later generation of perverts and rich and entitled people, mostly white men, hung out with Jeffrey Epstein. But an A&E docuseries, The Secrets of Playboy, shows how Playboy's venues became a seedy playground for sexual abuse, rape, and bestiality. According to Hefner's girlfriend, Sandra Theodore, Hef, quote, demanded sex 5 nights a week. You couldn't satisfy him. He wanted more and more and more and more. It was cult-like. The women had been groomed and led to believe they were part of his family. Sound familiar? It's exactly what was happening down in that jet, flying people like Donald Trump and other white predators back and forth to Love Island, as it was known, or this weird, horrible place where girls as young as 14 were being groomed and offered to wealthy men. Quoting again from the documentary on Hefner. And Mickey Garcia, former director of Playmate Promotions, said Hefner hosted weekly, quote, pig nights, during which he would bring in, quote, ugly prostitutes to have sex with friends and celebrities, people you've heard of. He also kept a stockpile of quaaludes known as the mansion as leg spreaders, and was regarded as a necessary evil because they made women, quote, do anything. And then, of course, both Kinsey and Hefner were heroes to wife abuser Johnny Carson, the famous late-night host that other late-night TV hosts idealized because he gave people like Letterman his break in stand-up comedy. Divorce and philandering was a cheery way of life, and he had found a patron saint. World-class creep Johnny Carson became a friend of Hefner and also would quote Kinsey. Carson's casual banter about his own and other powerful white males' affairs and divorces and serial philandering and social, quote, monogamy contributed to the normalization of divorce and sexual predatory behavior as acceptable, no big deal, all-American rite of passage. Carson's flippant attitude toward fidelity didn't evolve in a vacuum. He was in tune with some other powerful icons of self-centered and any love ideas. Many videotapes of Johnny Carson in the 1960s, in terms of episodes of The Tonight Show, were lost in a fire at NBC's archives, but part of Ayn Rand, the writer Ayn Rand, the libertarian right-wing writer, first appeared in The Tonight Show and survived. Carson snubbed his other guests that evening and kept Ayn Rand on for an entire 90 minutes. Now, Ayn Rand is a big hero to the tech bros these days. People like Elon Musk use her writing as a justification for his greed and his power-hungry lording it over ordinary mortals like us. And he, in turn, uses artificial insemination to have multiple babies with multiple women to create his own inheritance, genetically tested to have perfect babies with high IQs, hopefully. And so do other billionaires. Fast forwarding. These are Ayn Rand's disciples. Okay, Carson snubbed his other guests that evening and kept Rand on for an entire 90 minutes. No wonder. Rand stroked his ego and the ego of white male strivers like Carson and like Musk today, with her gospel of predatory domination and acquisitive capitalism as evidence of the apex of a powerful white male's achievement. Carson put Rand on his show 3 times. Another favorite of The Tonight Show was Playboy's Hugh Hefner. During Carson's frequent asides about his failed relationships, quote, this is one of his jokes, the difference between a divorce and a legal separation is that a legal separation gives a husband time to hide his money, end quote, ha ha ha. Carson never mentioned how his children fared, not well, while they navigated one broken home after another. Nor did Carson mention what happens to boys who grow up fatherless, that it's the single worst thing that studies show that can happen to a young male. If you ask why there are so many disgruntled young males today and in so much trouble, where the school shooters and other people come from, there's one thread that runs through a lot of this, through the kids that commit suicide, self-harm, and all the rest, and it's divorce. Face it, deal with it. We've made divorce fashionable because a lot of people feel guilty and don't want to be honest about it. Is that a hard saying? Yeah, but it happens to be true. Nor did Carson speculate about how entire communities would fare when the partners with young children were routinely abandoned. Carson never mentioned the fact that in his day, divorced women with children were at especially high risk of ending up in poverty. None of Carson's witty asides included stories about the exponentially multiplying number of children sitting alone in the back of airplanes that I used to see in the 70s and 80s when I was in the religious right going to speak, and there'd be a kid sitting there crying while flying unaccompanied between visits to divorced parents. In his many repeated witty aside, hide the money, ha ha ha, clips and jokes, Carson left unsaid the fact that most women's standard of living crashed by 25% after a divorce. In interviews quoted in People magazine, August 19, 1991, 2 of Carson's 4 wives said he had a cold, distant relationship with his sons he abandoned again and again through divorce. Why is that the warmth he shows on the stage, which everybody in the nation loves and gets, is not there for his own children, asked Carson's wife, Joanna. And according to his son's mother, Jody Carson, wasn't around that much. He was always working. John was violent and he drank. The writer Truman Capote, was a neighbor and said he was mean as hell to her. That's Carson. He'd get drunk and start beating his wife, and she would take refuge in my apartment. And Jody recalled that when she was asked a question, Carson tore up their living room and then started beating me all over my chest, end quote. That's Truman Capote talking. Okay, so this is the hero of American stand-up comedians. And he joked about divorce, beat up his own wife, was miserable to his family, abandoned his sons. Well, guess what? That became a pattern that became more acceptable because of him. Okay, how about Jeffrey Epstein to bring it up to the present day? And the Epstein saga of rape and child abuse, and many, quote, respectable conservatives and liberals in the legal profession stepping up to defend him or get on his plane and go rape children on his island. Too harsh, but what else do you think was happening? Including the Andrew, the former prince. Ponder the top conservative lawyers who lied repeatedly on behalf of Jeffrey Epstein and denigrated his victims in defense. Picture a liberal, quote unquote, President Bill Clinton hanging out on the Lolita Express, and that being okay with the Democratic Party voters until it wasn't. Well, Democratic Party voters, liberals who had been told by the academic elite that, only old-fashioned stupid Christians were monogamous. Well, how about the 53-page indictment prepared by law enforcement officials in 2007 that should have landed Epstein in prison for life, but of course didn't, because with friends like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump defending him, and longtime Democratic Party donor Epstein hired well-connected Republican lawyers, including former independent counsel Kenneth Starr, and scored, quote, one of the most lenient deals for a serial child rapist in history, according to the Miami Herald, thanks to the cooperation of the prosecutor, Trump's future labor secretary, Alex Acosta. Trump ties to Jeffrey Epstein. Trump called Epstein a terrific guy. You know all that because we've been asking why Trump wouldn't release everything. Well, of course, because he's plastered all over it like filth gets plastered on dirty underwear. And Trump's Attorney General, William Barr, whose father was an Epstein boss at Dalton, did his best to cover up Trump's connection to the rapist, as did Bill Clinton. And famous lawyer Alan Dershowitz and Kenneth Starr helped Epstein evade prison time as well as represented Trump in his impeachment trial. Talk about a narrow circle. Talk about everything coming full circle. In a New Yorker article written by Connie Bruck, tracked Dershowitz's career of defending men accused of sexual abuse and misconduct, and how, very much like Kinsey, he'd done so under the guise of his civil libertarian mantle. And Dershowitz once suggested that the age of consent should be 15 years old, the exact age of a child he was later accused of molesting, who was allegedly trafficked to him by Epstein. I say allegedly, we don't know, but interesting that some of his lawyers were also involved in the sexual shenanigans. Which is to say that these days, Jeannie and I find ourselves something like a fish caught by chance on some deep ocean line. That's my wife and me, 56 years of marriage. A prehistoric species dating back hundreds of millions of years that only surfaces due to some shark fisherman's gill net. People regard a long marriage these days as weird and view sexual intimacy as something dispensable. There's a book out by a woman right now saying that she found she had terminal breast cancer, so she left her husband and went off to have sexual experiences, very Kinsey-like, sleeping with dozens of men, trying this and that. This is what you see every day in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Guardian. The left-wing press still recycles all this as if it's something new and wonderful to be discovered. The Kinsey-esque idea that we're pushing back against Christianity and traditional religion or traditional Hinduism or traditional Islam. And this is good because we've got to liberate ourselves, blah, 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 blah. And then you get Epstein. And then all of a sudden everybody's up in arms because we went too far. And then we have kids using porn for sex education of choking and raping and slapping and hitting and all the rest of it. And everybody wants to do something about it. Way too late. So my question to you today is, as the final act of the sexual revolution plays out in Donald Trump doing everything with his so-called Justice Department to not release the real information on Kinsey-esque rapist Jeffrey Epstein, the kind of person that, had he been doing what he did back when Johnny Carson was a talk show host, would have been a frequent guest, and they could have made jokes about young girls and how funny this was, very much like Trump's birthday card. And where liberal Democrats went along with Clinton, credibly accused of rape. Yes, the whole Jennifer Flowers incident and everything else kept being brushed under the carpet. Why do you think Hillary wasn't elected? Talk about baggage. So maybe it's time to look at something that I talk about in my book, The Gospel of Zip, when I talk about the very basics we need. You know, Andrew Tate says we need to end marriage, that guys shouldn't get married anymore, that it's just a trap that women set. And that sounds very much like second wave feminism. They said the same thing. And if Jeannie and I had followed the most famous of the second wave feminists writing against marriage and having children back in the day, would Jeannie be happier now? And I think she wouldn't be. She's a very happy woman because she loves her family and she put up with a lot of shit from me. I describe myself as an asshole groomed by divine right to be an asshole at the beginning of this book. But we had a long journey we traveled together, and I learned to change because I really loved her. Love can do things. So I just want to end with this that comes from section 207 in my book. That's all online for free on YouTube at thegospelofzip.com. Free, all 8 hours. I read it out loud. If you like listening to books, go to YouTube and listen to this book, or you can buy it on Amazon. Section 207. So let's just repeat something that any hunter-gatherer could have told you before Jesus was a twinkle in anybody's eye. This is nothing to do with Christianity. This is the way every culture has survived that survived, and why ours won't. With Elon Musk out there inseminating dozens of nameless women who want to somehow bear their perfect child with him, or a Russian oligarch who has now got 100 sons because they're getting rid of all the female embryos because he just wants sons using American surrogate mothers. We're in an age of madness. Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump. You don't like it? You don't like these predators? Well, then let's admit this, and I say it in section 207. The ideal social order we need to thrive includes these things, and there is no wiggle room on this. All right? There is none. It's all self-justifying bullshit if you think there's wiggle room on this. 1, a stable family. 2, a safe and coherent neighborhood. 3, a vibrant civic life. And 4, a set of shared values that neighbors use to build healthy communities. Values that Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, and Alfred Kinsey didn't share. Values the academic elite that called themselves leftists but instead weren't anything but, and have created a fascistic world of reaction to their overreaction against the norms of marriage and love and bonding and childcare, fidelity, and sticking with the project of a relationship. And now we bear the full brunt. The sexual revolution was a disaster. And I say that as a pro-gay marriage liberal activist. And I say that as a man who supports the right to divorce for women who were abused or men who were in dead-end relationships. But I also say that as a man who was forgiven by Jeannie, as I talk about in this book, for my own stupidity. And she gave me many chances, and we put it back together again, and marriage works. And we are surrounded by love, and we are not lonely. And the lonely world that Jeffrey Epstein creates in his cell alone as he hangs himself from a bunk bed is the one our culture is inheriting through people like Bill Clinton, through people like Donald Trump, through people who think that divorce can be casual and easy without understanding we ruined a whole generation of fatherless young men. Get a grip. Liberal, right-wing, conservative, Trump voter, Democrat, I don't care. Let's be honest about the sexual revolution. My name is Frank Schaefer.